Welcome to a special edition of the Daily Dose of Septuagint, and we're continuing in our study of some basic tools. We've looked at Rolf's Honhart. Now today we're going to talk about dictionaries. Let's say you are cruising along here in your Septuagint, and you're in the Psalms, as is the case here. You're feeling pretty good about things, and then you bump into a word that you don't know, which happens rather frequently, of course. Let's say it's anus here. What are you going to do with that? Well, you might be tempted, if you spend a lot of time in the New Testament, to pull out your trusty BDAG, the Greek English Lexicon of the New Testament and early Christian literature. And this is a great lexicon. It's kind of the gold standard in that world of studying the New Testament. And let's say you flip it open to where you should find this word, and you would expect it to be somewhere between anasios and anoche, at least alphabetically. But as you can see here, it is not there. Why? Well, because this word doesn't show up in the New Testament, and apparently not in some of the early Christian literature that BDAG covers. BDAG doesn't cover everything. The vocabulary range of the Greek Old Testament is considerably larger than that of the New Testament, and so your New Testament lexicon may not have all of these words. And so where should you look? When you stumble into words that are unfamiliar in the Septuagint, what are you going to do? And so today we're going to talk about Septuagint-focused lexicons. And we're going to get into three of them, one by Takemitsu Muraoka, one by Lust, Lexicon, and Hausby, and a relative newcomer that's not necessarily a full dictionary, but we'll get into it. This one's edited by Eberhard Bond. And so we'll talk about these three. Now, to be clear, there are some other options that you could make use of. For instance, the Brill Greek English Lexicon is very helpful, and it covers many of the words that you'll see in the Septuagint. Same thing for the Cambridge Lexicon, but we're going to focus on these three that are dedicated to the Greek Old Testament. So let's begin with the work known as a Greek English Lexicon of the Septuagint. And this is edited by very famous Septuagint scholar Takemitsu Muraoka. You can see him there on the screen. He's done a lot of work on Septuagint grammar and a lot of other things. This particular lexicon was published in 2009 by Peters, and it is a response to a long-standing desire within the Guild for there to be a quality lexicon. In fact, really since the 60s and 70s, folks have been looking for a work like this, and so one of the major ones is the work by Muraoka. His textual basis is rather helpful, actually. He, at the time, made use of the Göttingen editions that existed at the time, as well as Rolf's Honhart, whenever necessary, as well as occasionally the larger Cambridge Septuagint. So he's making use of a pretty broad textual basis to generate the word list, if you will, that he is going to use. He focuses mostly on the critical text itself. He does occasionally get into some words that show up just in the textual variants, and even sometimes, but not all that often, in wording found in like Aquila or Symmachus or something like that. He's mostly going to be focusing on the actual critical text itself, which makes sense in terms of being efficient and pragmatic. Now, what makes this lexicon quite interesting is that Muraoka prioritizes definitions. What he's going to try to do is explain what a word means with a sentence, which he finds to be more useful than simply giving a English word-for-word gloss or equivalent. He does sometimes do that, as we'll see, but his main goal is to describe the semantic range of a given word. Now, philosophically, what is interesting about Muraoka's work, and we'll see how this contrasts with the next one here in a few minutes, is that in the intro on page 8, he summarizes that he's going to approach the Septuagint as a Greek document. He is in the school of thought that I'll cover down the road in a different video that mainly looks at the Septuagint as a Greek thing, not necessarily just a window to the Hebrew. What was it like to experience the Septuagint as a Greek speaker who may or may not have known the original languages? And so he's going to try it out. He's going to try to find out what sense a reader in the period roughly from 250 BC to 100 AD, who was ignorant of the Hebrew Aramaic, which would have been most of the readership presumably, might have made of the translation. In other words, he is a reader focused, in terms of the ancient world, a reader-focused lexicon here. And that very much shapes the way he goes about his work. And really puts him outside like the Netz philosophy, the New English Translation of the Septuagint. I'll cover that in a separate video. where they want to stay a little bit closer to the Hebrew. Muraoka is of the school that's going to more focus on what would the average post-classical reader in this period have understood a given word to mean. Well, let's test drive this lexicon. So here is the page where you can find that word that we are curious about, anus here. And so you'll notice it's fairly standard for a lexicon. This is an adjective, and so he provides the neuter ending there. And here is the thing I want to draw your attention to. Instead of giving just a simple word-for-word gloss like you might have learned in Greek 1 or Greek 2, here's how he describes it: characterized by lack of understanding and intelligence. That's how he believes that we should understand the basic idea behind this particular word. And it's quite simple here. Nous is mind. Alpha privative there is saying basically it's unmind. And so lack of understanding, that kind of thing makes sense. Now, he does provide silly as one possible gloss. And then what else does he provide? He will give you a handful of, not all, but a handful of places where you might find it, like Hosea 7:11, Psalm 48:11, which is actually Psalm 49 in the Hebrew, and that's actually the one that we had on screen. So he will provide a selection of places where you can go see it in context. In fact, he does even provide some of the surrounding context so that you can get a feel for it. And he also, not always, but often will provide some synonyms like anoetos or aphron, which means foolish, moros, similarly, suniemi, another word for mental type stuff, a little bibliography there. That's the kind of stuff that he's going to provide in most of his entries. Now, you can see some of the others on the page. If you look at anoche, this is closer to a gloss, opportunity, although he does provide a bit more information, opportunity for an action, typically with an infinitive. Here's another reference in 1 Maccabees. Antagonizomai, to contend as an opponent. You probably wouldn't use that as a gloss, although it's still fairly short. You might try to come up with something like fight or something like that as a gloss. So he's trying, again, to describe the basic premise behind that particular word. Once again, here showing you a few other synonyms and so on. So that's the feel. Now, some of Muraoka's entries can be half a page if it's a preposition or a very common word, and then other times they might just be 1 or 2 lines, as you can see on screen. So that's the basic idea behind Muraoka, and I love using this. This is probably my personal go-to. It's not the only thing I use, but if I'm trying to study a word in the Septuagint, or even a word in the New Testament that I know is probably influenced by the Greek Old Testament, perhaps because it's citing it as a scriptural quotation or something like that, I'll often go here as well as some of the other lexicons. Now, unfortunately, Muraoka's lexicon, if you want to buy it in print, it's rather pricey. However, fortunately, it is available for free on the Internet Archive, archive.org, so that's super helpful. Depending on your account with archive.org, you may or may not have to check it out, so to speak, for like an hour and then turn it back in, assuming it's available. But very, very helpful. So you can just go to archive.org, search for the title, and you'll find it very quickly. So super duper helpful that this immensely important lexicon is available for free on the internet. Let's move on now to the second of our chosen lexicons. This is the Greek English lexicon of the Septuagint, often abbreviated LEH for its editors, Johann Lust, Eric Einekel, and Katrin Hausby. So often you'll refer to this as LEH. This was published most recently, at least, in 2003. Its second edition was in 96. The first edition was 1992, and it's put out by the German Bible Society. The textual basis for this particular work is simply Rolf's Honhart, so it's not getting into some of the additional type of content like the Göttingen edition or the Cambridge edition, and they defend that in their introduction, but that's a fairly good choice. One of the reasons why they did that, though, is the Rolf's Honhart text has been digitized, and so they're able to use some computer-aided technologies to generate some of the statistics and so forth. And so what they provide not only includes morphological tagging and some statistics, as I'll show you, but their main thing that they're giving you is not so much a definition as with Muraoka. They are giving you glosses or word-for-word equivalents in English, things that you could use in your own translation as opposed to a more wordy, sentence-level description of the semantic range. And that's what a lot of lexicons do. That's probably what you're most familiar with, whereas the Muraoka approach was perhaps a bit different than what you're used to. And so that's what they're going to give you. And they'll give you between 1 and 5. They're not going to go overboard with the different options. And their philosophy is considerably different than that of Muraoka. Now, they have a very lengthy essay about this at the introduction of the lexicon, so I'm not going to quote a lot from it, but they go through some of the ins and outs of a fundamental question that I've already broached, which is this. How should we understand a given word in, say, the Greek of Genesis? Should we understand it more from the perspective of the translator in 200 BC or whatever, and how they were thinking through, okay, here's the Hebrew word I have, and how should I bring it out in a Greek equivalent? Should we understand it more from that angle, that is, as a lens on some sort of underlying Hebrew word that is going to exert some sort of influence on this choice of a equivalent in Greek? That's one philosophy. The other philosophy is what we cover with Muraoka, which is, let's assume the reader doesn't know Hebrew, and how would they interpret this word based on just their knowledge of post-classical Greek. And the LEH book, the lexicon, is going to side with the former perspective. And here's what they say. Septuagint Greek is first of all a translation Greek. So they're emphasizing the fact that it is indeed a translation. Of course, Muraoka agrees with that, but they're going to put a heavier emphasis on this. They're going to say any lexicon of the Septuagint should therefore refer to the Semitic original. And they will do that quite often. In fact, they'll often just throw Hebrew words in there as a way to help unpack what a Greek word would be. They caveat this, at least in those cases where the deviations between a Greek word and its Semitic equivalent, that is, assuming we know what the original was that they're translating from, can be explained at the level of the morphemes. And this puts them closer to the Net's philosophy, that is the New English translation of the Septuagint, which does similarly, mostly viewing the Greek more as an interlinear, if you will, for the underlying Hebrew. Now, to be clear, Lewis, Steinickel, and Houseby don't go all the way in that direction. They are often quite sophisticated in how they are also interacting with other Greek type things and not simply giving us a heavily Semitic slant on the definition. They're trying to kind of balance a lot of those different considerations, but they do admit that they are going to place relatively heavier weight on what the Hebrew would be. So they're going to stress at the end of the day what a translator intended, knowing the Hebrew that they're working from, and less what a reader who doesn't necessarily know Hebrew in Alexandria or wherever would think. And so that does make it, at times, distinct from Muraoka. Many times, even as I was just preparing for this video, you'll see that they'll give basically the same types of glosses that you might find in Muraoka, but there will be times where they might differ in terms of a more Greek-focused meaning versus a more Semitically influenced focus of meaning, which is what you're going to find in this particular lexicon. Let's take a look at how it appears. And so here's our entry for anus there, and they provide some statistical information that you probably don't need if you have Bible software, but here at the top, A means adjective, and then the 00121, you have 5 numbers in a row separated by hyphens. Each of those 5 correspond to the frequency of this word in 5 different corpora. The first one being the Pentateuch, so that would be the first number, the 0 here. The second one, so the second 0 would be from the historical books like Joshua up through Chronicles. The third number, and so in this case 1, would be from the prophetic books. The fourth number from the poetic books, including Proverbs and so forth. So that'd be like 2 here, and then the apocryphal books, and then the final number there after the equal sign is, of course, the total. So for those who want to see the distribution, that can be helpful. But again, if you're going to use Logos or Accordance, you probably would just figure that out on your own. They do provide a handful of instances. They won't provide all of them, but in this case, it's a fairly small number. But if it's a lot, they won't provide all of them, of course. They'll provide some key instances, and here's the thing I want to draw your attention to. Instead of providing like that whole sentence like Muraoka did, here are the 3 different word-for-word equivalents that they're suggesting that you could use in a translation: without understanding, senseless, or silly. They probably could have done more, but that's what they have chosen to do. Yeah, look at some others like anoche here. You see the stats. Give an example, First Maccabees, and they give you relief, respite, or pause. Antagonismai, we saw that, to be the opponent, to antagonize, and so on. And then, again, a fairly simple bibliography there. So that's the typical kind of thing you'll see with LEH. You notice the entries here are quite short because they're just trying to prioritize a small number of equivalents as opposed to describing the semantic range. They're not necessarily going to provide as many parallels or synonyms as you see with Muraoka. So in my opinion, you should probably use both. I think it's helpful to see these two different opinions on what a given word might be mean, especially if you're doing some more advanced research. Now, LEH is not as expensive as Muraoka, but if you're on a budget, helpfully this one is also available on the Internet Archive, and so you can just search for the title. And in fact, you can see the prior editions. I think there is at least a second edition. This one is the third edition. So very, very helpful that you can have ready access. In fact, you can download this as a PDF and keep it with you. So very, very nice that that is available. Let's turn now to our third and final example, the Historical and Theological Lexicon of the Septuagint, sometimes abbreviated HTLS. The general editor for this project is Eberhard Bahn, although there are numerous contributors that are making it possible. And the first volume that you see on screen there that covers alpha through gamma, so not a large section of the alphabet, came out in 2020. There are plans for 5 more volumes to finish out the alphabet. I don't know the exact date for all those, but it is an enormous project sponsored by Moore Ziebeck there, and it's a huge undertaking. Here's the interesting thing about it. It's not your grandma's lexicon. It is not going to provide essentially every word that you might find, for instance, in Rolf's Honhart. It's focusing on roughly 600 words that they consider important. Perhaps important theologically, important because of how they shape the New Testament, important because they shed light on Jewish theology of the period, whatever the case might be. So there's a whole rationale behind the scenes for how they're selecting a very relatively small subset, still large of course though, each of these volumes is enormous, of words to focus on. And instead of providing glosses or definitions, and so lexicon here maybe is a bit of a misnomer in my opinion, it probably is more like a dictionary. But either way, what they provide are lexeme, that is word level articles, again on these quote unquote 600 plus or minus important words, that focus on tracing the semantic development of these words over time. And so how has the word shifted in meaning from, say, the Iliad up to Greek Genesis, and then maybe how is it used in the New Testament, and how is that similar to or different from the past, and so on. Focusing on 6 different bodies of writing to help them shape our understanding, each contributor, to shape our understanding of how this word has shifted and moved over time. So it's more of a philological work more than anything, at least sort of the study of the philology of a given word. And so they look at classical Greek literature, the papyri and inscriptions, of course the Septuagint, and then other Jewish literature in Greek, so including like the pseudepigrapha and so forth, the New Testament, and then early Christian literature, of course, in Greek. And so they're going to survey how is any given word used, if it's found, in such corpora. And in some sense, you could argue that it is a methodologically superior version of TDNT, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, but it's focused on the Septuagint. In fact, if you look at some of the articles, they often will cite TDNT or the German equivalent. TDNT has some well-known flaws, although I still find it to be useful to gather information, and this is established on a better foundation. It does some different things than TDNT, but that would be the closest point of comparison, I suppose. What does it look like? Well, here is an example from Akakas. And so you can see it is long. This article on this one word is rather lengthy, and you see it starts with the Greek literature and describes what's its range of meaning and where's some examples like in Pseudo-Plato or Demosthenes and so forth. And then you kind of get into some of the characteristics of its use across different authors, and then you can keep going and say, well, here it is in the papyri and inscriptions, or here it is in the Septuagint and some observations, and so it goes on for several pages. It's not going to be a dictionary that you look up a simple word meaning for something. It's more if you really want to dig into how it arrived at this particular meaning and what's its history, this is the kind of resource that you're going to use for that. And so it's more for, I suppose, more advanced academic study and less for help me figure out what this word is. But it does scratch a very big itch in the guild of more rigorous and detailed work on tracing the development of various words and how that might shape how it is used, for instance, in the Greek of Micah or what have you. And so that's the basic thrust of the HTLS. Sadly, it's profoundly expensive. So we're looking at 289 euros here. So unless you have access to a nice library, most non-specialists are not going to have their own copy of this. My hope would be once it's complete and perhaps it's loaded into Logos or something like that, perhaps it'll be cheaper. But right now we're stuck with a very expensive volume, probably low distribution. Morzebek doesn't make anything cheap, frankly. And so that's an unfortunate reality that we have to navigate. But maybe you can get it on interlibrary loan if you're lucky. Well, hopefully this has been a helpful introduction to these three major Septuagint lexicons. Maybe down the road we'll talk about some of the other tools that you can use like Brill and what have you. But these first two in particular are essentially they are the BDAG, but for Septuagint studies, if that analogy makes sense. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Hopefully I've made dictionaries more interesting than maybe you otherwise thought. And so thanks for tuning in.